Wow, it's so great to see so many people here on screen. My name is Philip Steenkamp, President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University. And I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome Dr. Andrea A. Davis, today's presenter, who I'll be introducing shortly. And also our Associate Director of Human Rights and Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, Alejandro Campos-Garcia, who facilitated bringing Dr. Davis to our campus for what I know will be a very inspiring talk today. And welcome to all of you for joining us as well. I would like to begin, of course, as we always do, with a land acknowledgement, and is with deep, deep gratitude that I acknowledge our presence here on the lands of the Kasapsan and Lekwungen ancestors and families. Those families and ancestors have lived on these lands from time immemorial, and it is with huge gratitude that we work and live and learn on these amazing lands. And I would extend an offer to Dr. Davis to come and visit us sometime so we can show you the bounty of these incredible lands and join us in our appreciation of them as well. So just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. Your microphones have been muted to begin today, but you can ask questions using the chat, and there's a dedicated question and answer session toward the end of the talk. And when we get to that part of the talk, we'll just ask you to use the raise hand function. And also feel free to leave your camera off or on, but I would say it's always nice to see a few friendly faces, so I hope that some of you do leave your cameras on as well. Now, we are coming to the end of Black History Month, but of course here at Royal Roads, we celebrate Black history throughout the year, but we also celebrate in a particular way during the month of February. And throughout February, Royal Roads has been celebrating Black History Month by sharing resources, stories, and voices from our university community. Last week, for instance, Student Services hosted a Black History Month edition of their Life Lounge series, in which I know they engaged in thoughtful discussion, storytelling, and celebration of the achievements and experiences of the Black community. And our library has also hosted visitors at its Black History Month virtual and in-person displays, which feature resources on topics such as Black Canadian history, Black culture and communication, and Black women in leadership, just to name a few of the topics that have been covered. And I really encourage you all to take a look at these displays if you haven't had a chance to engage with them yet. As many of you are aware, the theme of this year's Black History Month in Canada is Ours to Tell. So centering Black voices is a much needed pedagogical approach, one for which our speaker today is a true champion. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Davis about just what happens when Black people's ideas about themselves are centered, and we have a model for engaging the histories of Black people in Canada that exceeds a simple anti-racism lens. So with that, I am so excited to welcome one of the nation's thought leaders in interdisciplinary studies, Dr. Andrea A. Davis, to our virtual campus. Dr. Davis is a professor in the Department of Humanities at York University and academic convener of the 2023 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences. She established and coordinates the Black Canadian Studies Certificate at York. A gifted instructor, her most recent teaching accolade is the 2021 3M National Teaching Fellowship. Congratulations on that, Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis's research analyzes questions of race, gender, and place. And her latest book, Horizon Sea Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation, which was published in 2022, imagines new reciprocal relationships among Black, Indigenous, and other racialized women. And she's dedicated to the scholarship of others, serving as well as the co-editor of the Journal of Canadian Studies. So with that, I'd like to extend a huge, warm Royal Roads welcome to Dr. Andrea A. Davis, and over to you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Philip and Alejandro, and the others in this team at Royal Roads who extended this very generous invitation. Thank you also for that incredibly generous acknowledgement and introduction. I myself come to you today from the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I honor and acknowledge this land and its peoples who have been here thousands of years before the forced arrival of my own ancestors as enslaved Africans. Neil, can you share the first screen? Thank you. In my talk today, A Project Toward Black Life, Teaching Black Studies in the Humanities, I begin with a quote in Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, who recalls the opening of the school that would become the Tuskegee Institute, the first all-Black post-secondary institute in the U.S. South, and notes that among the first cohort of 30 students, some had studied Latin and Greek and felt that this accomplishment, in his words, entitled them to special distinction. He then goes on to recall what he describes as one of the saddest things he had seen during his travel through Black communities in Alabama in the late 19th century. This saddest thing was the image, quote, of a young man who had attended some high school, sitting down in a one-room cabin with grease on his clothing, filth all around him, and weeds in the yard and garden, engaged in studying French grammar. I begin with this memory of a lone Black boy engaged in the study of a subject that seems to carry no direct utilitarian value, as in no value immediately ameliorating the conditions of his poverty. To think about Black people's fraught relationship to the academy and the humanities in particular. In other words, I want to think about the seeming incongruity of Black people's bodies and presences in Canadian universities, particularly when they are not engaged in the form of utilitarian knowledge production meant to facilitate their accommodation within a social structure in which their participation has been predetermined in advance of their arrival. I'm thinking, for example, of why Black Canadian university students are more likely to choose careers in social work, sociology, criminology, accounting, and nursing than in languages, literatures, and philosophy. Neil, can you stop sharing now? Thank you. Part of Black students' hesitancy to pursue studies in the humanities, of course, has to do with the fact that they, first of all, struggle to see themselves represented in these fields in a way that is useful to their desire for life and freedom. Study and research in the humanities have long been regarded as reserved for a small, privileged post-Enlightenment elite. This idea of the humanities as a reserved and sacrosanct field derives from the idea that it is a field of study suited primarily for those few who can afford to participate in learning solely for learning's sake. This notion of the privileged humanities student, certainly at the time of publication of Up From Slavery in 1901, and certainly in the post-bellum U.S. South, was reserved largely for wealthy white men, some women, likely from a long tradition of enslavers or the religious clergy, whose very wealth had been produced by the subordination of Black people, a group of people whom education would surely make unfit for their continued use as the producers of wealth for others within a well-established racial capitalist hierarchy. Indeed, the humanities, as the vanguard of a white supremacist imaginary, has been directly responsible for the construction of Indigenous and Black peoples' presumed inhumanity, and for providing the philosophical discourse that has supported and undergirded the conquest of Africa and the Americas, the theft of Indigenous lands, and chattel slavery. While this view of the humanities as a site of prestigious higher learning reserved for an elite minority may have shifted somewhat in the mid to late 20th century after the modest integrationist gains of the civil rights movement in the United States, the 21st century and growth of the neoliberal university have brought new challenges globally. An increased focus on the utilitarian value of university degrees in career-driven economies has led to a crisis within the humanities and liberal arts, where programs have been suffering from rapidly declining enrollments. Humanities programs in universities everywhere, from Ivy League institutions like Harvard to smaller liberal arts colleges in the United States and publicly funded universities across Canada, have been desperately trying to reimagine themselves and rearticulate their value within an increasingly skeptical post-secondary sector. In Ontario, home to a large percentage of first and second generation immigrants and aspiring middle-class families, the Conservative provincial government has deprioritized university education, appearing to place more value on the practical training skills provided by colleges than in the critical thinking skills acquired in universities. This assumption of a university degree as primarily about one's ability to participate immediately upon graduation in the capitalist machinery of overconsumption, precisely the reason, for example, why students with the most academic potential are encouraged to go after jobs with the highest salaries, is linked ironically to ideas about justice, equity, and inclusion. This understanding of justice derives from the belief in racial capitalist societies that the problem of racial inequity is primarily an economic problem that can be solved by providing Black people with education or training that will equip them for available jobs and increase their participation and entrance into the middle classes. This articulation of Black people's social challenges as a relationship to capital assumes that the primary problem Black people face are poverty and crime, and that crime is a byproduct of poverty. Since crime is already understood as a threat to the capitalist order, as in a threat to those who own capital, for liberal politicians, the alleviation of poverty and the participation of more and more Black people in the workforce is therefore good for everyone. As Rinaldo Walcott explains in his 2021 book on property, however, possession is not just about ownership. It's also about, quote, the authority invested in white people to direct all inferiors. End of quote. Neil, can you move to my second slide? Thank you. In Du Bois's response to Washington's invocation of the memory of the Black boy and the French grammar book, he critiques the idea that material prosperity is enough to transform Black degradation and restore Black subjectivity. Quote, so thoroughly did he learn the language and thought of triumphant commercialism and the ideals of material prosperity, that the picture of a lone Black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. The notion of economic justice espoused by Washington and others suggests that poor Black people will live better lives, not if we eradicate poverty for everyone, work towards less competitive forms of citizenship, or provide the means by which they might dream and imagine and otherwise, but if they are allowed to participate in the existing capitalist project of wealth creation in a way that sustains their own basic survival. These ideas are fundamental to the way racial capitalism works. In this model of justice, Washington's image of the boy in the one-room cabin might shift to an image of a boy in a 2 or 3-room house wearing clean clothing and with flowers in a garden. The French grammar book in either scene remains out of place. Can we stop sharing now? Thank you. The reality is that Black people have always had fraught relationships with educational institutions, even as they themselves have seen education as critical to a narrative of progressive freedom. Research on and about Black peoples see them and their communities largely as originating from a place of deficit. The questions that drive this kind of research are concerned with how to protect the capitalist state by bringing Black communities into meaningful economic participation, contextualizing their poverty, and containing or mitigating Black criminality. In other words, how can institutions of higher learning help Black people as descendants of formerly enslaved Africans, immigrants, and refugees to overcome their ongoing marginalization, maladaptation, and victimhood? Even as we participate in the formalization of these programs, we have to be careful, therefore, that they are not co-opted into the project of white supremacist knowledge production. In how we mistook the map for the territory and re-imprisoned ourselves in our unbearable wrongness of being, Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter traces the establishment of the first Black studies programs in the United States to a traumatic event, the 1968 murder of Martin Luther King Jr. Yet she also notes that Black studies' radical possibility in the ushering in of a new kind of world was quickly undercut, their original transgressive intentions diffused, and their energies rechanneled so they could be used to re-verify the very thesis of liberal universalism they had tried to dismantle in the first place. 55 years later, as we are now confronted with the criminalization of critical race theory in some states in the US, and even as we now turn to the task of making visible Black studies programs in Canada, how might this history of this fraught relationship with the Academy inform our actions? How do we ensure that these programs continue the work of shifting the discourse of knowledge and power within and beyond the Academy and make evident the deep ruptures in our social fabric while making possible what poet, writer, and thinker Dion Brand calls, quote, a grammar in which Black existence might be the thought and not the unthought might be. Since humanities as a site of Western hegemonic thought has shaped definitions of what Sylvia Wynter identifies as the Western bourgeois generic mode of the human subject in order to inscribe a discourse of non-humanity onto Black and Indigenous peoples, I suggest that the location of Black and Indigenous studies precisely in the humanities, a project that I championed in my recent tenure as chair of the Department of Humanities at York University, is critical to unlodging deeply entrenched racist ideologies and critical to transforming the white supremacist structures of Canadian universities. What might it mean to rethink the racist logic deeply rooted in Western thought, philosophy, literature, and religion, by re-articulating the fields of the humanities as a radical project toward and not against Black life. Positioning Black and Indigenous studies in the humanities has perhaps the greatest potential to radically transform universities by exposing their white supremacist ideological frameworks and offering a different set of theoretical paradigms for thinking about human relationships and human possibilities. When we understand, for example, that Black Canadian literature has work to do in the world because of the unfinished project of freedom, we approach its study as critical to the very preservation of Black life. Rather than demarcating Black objection, Black Canadian literature is interested in how one reasserts agency, freedom, and humanity. In the face of what Rinaldo Walcott calls Black diasporic catastrophe, and M. Norbese Philip names Mafa from the Kiswahili word for terrible occurrence or great disaster, Black Canadian literature must continually interrogate the deep ruptures caused by colonialism, even in the absence of a language that can articulate the depths of such a catastrophe. University students, the primary drivers of social and educational transformation, have been telling us since the 1960s in the United States that Black studies as a recognition of Black thought and imagination matters. As recently as 2015, while Barack Obama was still president, and against the backdrop of emerging Black Lives Matter movements globally, students in 80 colleges and universities around the United States mobilized a new Black student movement, demanding changes in student recruitment and retention, a more inclusive curriculum, increased resources, free tuition for Black and Indigenous students, and safe spaces. In 2016, a year later, at York University, undergraduate and graduate students demanded meetings with their deans, the university president, and the then provost, and called for a more diverse curriculum that reflected the interests of an increasingly diverse student body, as well as the hiring of Black faculty. It was these demands and the emotional labor of students that brought a group of Black faculty members, their allies, and the dean together to discuss how they might respond to the needs of the students. Out of these conversations, we began the curricular process that would lead to the development of a Black Canadian Studies certificate in the Department of Humanities that was launched in September 2018. Deliberately situated in the humanities and arts rather than the social sciences, the certificate seeks to center the thoughts, ideas, theories, histories, and expressive cultures of Black peoples in Canada, to center Black knowledges as valuable in and of itself and not as a tool toward anti-racism or anti-bias training. As a pan-university certificate with courses drawn from the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies and the School for the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design, the certificate combines compulsory courses in the departments of Humanities and History with elective courses in English, Writing, Public Policy and Administration, and the Department of Music. It also allows students to take a placement course in their fourth year, where they have been placed with Toronto District School Board trustees, MPPs, museums, and community organizations, so they can leverage their understanding of Black cultures in Canada into careers in a range of sectors. Since the certificate is open to students across the university who complete it alongside their majors, we have students not only from liberal arts and professional studies and arts, media, performance, and design, but also from the Faculty of Science. With a direct entry option, we're also able to attract professionals looking for upskilling opportunities across Canada. The certificate underscores the fact that Black studies need to include the study of history, literature, expressive cultures, and philosophical thought, not just criminology, sociology, or social work, which, as much as we need them, often center Blackness as a problem to be solved. Ideally, Black studies programs would be truly interdisciplinary, transforming the professional fields as well as the sciences, engineering, and health so they can be responsive to Black people's wide-ranging ideas. If we understand that these programs are always already oppositional, created out of tension, protest, and activism, and created in response to violence and pain, then we must also accept that they're not just about participating in knowledge production. They are about transforming the core character of the university and the societies in which we live. Black studies in this sense must be included in any decolonizing project. We must work tirelessly to change belief systems. If we're going to address the major challenges of our time, we must be honest about the past and bold in the future. Inviting Indigenous and Black studies into meaningful and transformative dialogue in the work of universities, in the work of broad interdisciplinary knowledge production, begins that hard work. Intervening into the climate catastrophe, achieving justice for women, poor people, queer and trans people, and other oppressed peoples of the world requires a different set of logics. Black studies offers such a logic of justice, a relational logic, and a practice of hope. This is the time to decide the kind of world, the kind of future we want. And if you're listening to this talk today, then I believe you also desire to interrupt something, no matter how small, in your own thinking, in your own being in the world. I ask you, therefore, to be committed in any and every way you think you can to creating a university that's truly inclusive and just, that moves us toward and not against Black life, that moves us toward and not against Indigenous life, that moves us toward a world in which all of us have freedom. I must believe that such a world is possible. Thank you.
I just need a second after that. That was one of the most beautiful presentations I've heard in many years. A very moving presentation. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much, Professor Davis. So I now opening the session for question and answers, and I would like first of all to invite Philip Steenkamp to ask the first question, and after that we can move to more open forum conversation with Andrea. Please, Philip.
Thank you, Alejandro. And the only reason he's asking me is so you have time to think of your questions and post them. I'm truly overwhelmed by this presentation, an extraordinary presentation, Dr. Davis, and very, very thought-provoking, and I don't use that in the cliched sense. But it certainly has interrupted my thinking about many things too. I was very struck, starting with that incredible image of the lone Black boy studying French grammar. I thought that was an extraordinary image, and it really set up the sort of scaffold for your presentation. And something that really struck me, I'm a student of African history and African literature, and a phrase you used, to avoid centering Blackness as a problem to be solved, I think is an extraordinarily powerful phrase. And you saw this transition in South African Black literature many years ago. I remember a novel came out by Jakes Madai, and there were no white people in that novel. And everybody was like, what's going on here? How could somebody in apartheid South Africa write a novel without white people in it? And it was an extraordinary moment, I think, in Black literary culture and history, which moved, I think, from that concept of centering Blackness as a problem to be solved, moved towards Black-centered voices. And it was the beginning of a resistance, I think, that led ultimately to the demise of apartheid as well. And so that interruption, I think, is so important in our thinking. And thank you so much for that. My question, though, is really about that intersection of Black studies and Indigenous studies. I wondered if you could elaborate a little more on that and where the opportunities are for collaboration and alliances in this move towards inclusion and justice that you speak so eloquently about.
Thank you so much, Philip. I just in responding, I just want to mention just a quick personal narrative about growing up as a working class child in Jamaica. Really, you know, out of the middle class, not land owning family at all, and spending all of my summers and many of my days reading underneath our mango trees because I had a grandmother who I didn't realize at the time was the most powerful and influential feminist I would ever meet. As long as I had a book open, she would never ask me to do housework, although that's supposed to be, you know, what girl children did in the Caribbean. Whenever I had a book open, I could read. And so I read voraciously everything all the time, and literature became my world and has continued to inform it. So I could be, right? I could literally be that little lone boy, right, in that shack reading that French grammar book. The question you ask about Black and Indigenous studies is a very relevant one. I think that this talk that I gave today could very easily replace Black studies with Indigenous studies. I think that Black and Indigenous peoples have been located in the university in knowledge production in very similar ways, that in both cases tend to write us, right, to think about us as problems to be solved in the most generous ways of how to, right, like I said, invite us into participation, how to mitigate and overcome historical challenges. But it's a narrative that tends to center on loss, on violence. And it's not that violence and loss is not there and has not happened. But I think that something more powerful happens when we enter those conversations, not from the place not from the, or solely from the place of deficit, but when we sit and think through Indigenous knowledges, through Black theories and ideas about what Black people and Indigenous people themselves have to think, right? Have what they think, what they create, what they imagine, how they're articulating their own lives. There is something really dramatic that happens, not only in terms of giving agency and voice, but also in redirecting the values of the university, the values of universities and the values encoded in its knowledge production. At your university, I'll give an example. When I was chair in my last year as chair, the then director of the Indigenous Studies program, which was located in another department in the social sciences, approached me and asked for support to move, right? Approached me with a desire to move the Indigenous Studies program into humanities. Out of this recognition, this same recognition that what Indigenous scholars want to do, right, is to focus on Indigenous thought, Indigenous languages, Indigenous histories, and from their own perspectives, rather than this over determination of violence, this over centering of deficit, this over centering or exclusive centering of loss. And so we now have both Black Studies certificate, which we're developing into a major and minor, and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Humanities. And York has since also opened a Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, which also builds on this. this effort. History of not only embodied knowledge, but embodied art as well, right? In which this thinking otherwise, this reimagining of the world emerges out of a deep historical knowledge and a deep creative process that often is eluded when we enter these subjects solely through the social sciences. So as someone who, like I said, was oriented as a child and very early, somewhat oddly perhaps, to the humanities, to books, to thinking, not initially with white people per se, with Black people per se, but just reading everything and all things. I understand, right, the power of story, the power of storytelling, the power of representation, but also the power of voice and the power of the imagination. The world that we live in is so exhaustingly violent and cruel that I think for many of us who live violence every day, if we didn't have a space outside of that to create and imagine something else, we would be lost. And I think that many of us who are Indigenous and Black are trying to do this work. And Indigenous and Black scholars and activists are increasingly, in the last 3, 5, 10 years, joining together. Black Lives Matter in Toronto emerged very much as a coalition between Black, Indigenous, queer, and trans folk. Some of the most interesting work by scholars, I think about Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson's new book, is being done through that kind of collaboration. I think about the alchemy lectures we did at York last fall that brought Black and Indigenous peoples together. So there's some of the richest work coming out of the humanities is coming from that space of collaboration and shared thinking.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I know Alejandro is going to facilitate the Q&A. I would remind people, please, to use the raise hand function. And you can also, once acknowledged, unmute yourselves. And we do have 15, 16 minutes for questions here. So please, please do ask your questions. So Alejandro, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Philip. Please feel free to participate the way you think is better for you. So if you want to post your question or comments in the chat, do so. If you want to ask the question directly to Professor Davis, that's also welcome. So please. Ali, please.
Hi, Dr. Davis. I found that just so moving as well, and I thank you. And you said something that I'm just gonna ask you to maybe say once more, because I found it really powerful, and I missed one part of it. And it was you were saying that Black studies could be a place for marginalized folks to find that kind of relational logic and that hope. And one more thing, and I thought it had to do with the imagination, but I wasn't sure. Do you remember that part? I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I think what I said was that we need a different set of logics, right? If we're going to overcome the major challenges of our time, you know, climate catastrophe, social injustice, and so on. And that I think that Black studies offers us that kind of logic, a logic of justice, a logic of relationality, and a logic of collaboration. Again, going back to the question about Black studies and Indigenous studies, if you look at every moment of significant and sustained Black activism, talking about the movement against slavery in the United States, that movement was also the catalyst that gave birth to first wave feminism, right? To women activists who are part of the abolitionist movement, but also seeking justice for themselves. In the middle of the 20th century, the civil rights movement created the possibility for a movement for queer people, the gay pride movement, again opened the space for second wave feminism. The creation of Black studies programs made available other kinds of ethnic studies programs that also, and studies that enter the university at the same time. So at its core, Black studies, Black activism has always been about collaboration. You know, when Malcolm X, I tell my students that when Malcolm X died, when he was shot, he was held, right, by an American Vietnamese woman, right? She was the one who was holding him as he was dying. So that, you know, there's always been this idea of justice for Black people, but justice for Black people meaning and making possible justice for others. So you know, when we think about the work that Black feminists have done, for example, right, in opening up thinking in feminisms beyond a kind of singular hegemonic white middle class framework, when we think about the really interesting and dynamic work that's happening in queer studies and trans studies, Blacks, you know, Black studies scholars are at the forefront of a lot of that work. And so I think of Black studies not as insular, not necessarily as bounded, right, but as the best kind of model, right? And you know, in universities, it's difficult in Canadian universities because of funding models that make it difficult to work across faculties. But I would like to see a Black studies major that includes, of course, the humanities and social sciences and the arts, but also environmental studies, education, health, engineering, and science, right? I think those possibilities are there. They just haven't been, right, opened up enough. And, you know, again, I think of the work that people like Dionne Brand does in her writing and thinking, Christina Sharp, Rinaldo Walcott, who I've cited several times, Sylvia Wynter, all of these scholars are thinking in relational terms, collaborative terms, terms of justice that include all peoples, Indigenous peoples, other peoples, right, who are oppressed. And I think that's foundational to the work and activism of Black people and scholars.
Yep. Deb.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. Really terrific talk. And yes. So you know, the commonality that I'm wondering about is the role of women in leading a lot of these movements and resurfacing the ontologies, the traditional ontologies. And I'm wondering if you might speak about the role of women in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a Black feminist writer, thinker, teacher. So women feature very, very prominently in my research. They are invariably the people I turn to. I would say perhaps in terms of a Black female scholar who has contributed to really overturning ontological, you know, ideas about difference and humanity and so on, is Sylvia Wynter, who has offered us the most precise, accurate, and powerful response to, you know, to the white philosophers coming out of European humanism by methodologically overturning all of those assumptions about who gets to count and who gets to matter. You know, and in my own work as a reader and scholar of Black literature, I have depended heavily on Black women writers. Not that they're wonderful men. I think of David Cheriandi's work. I love David deeply. In others, you know, like have also been meaningful, but it's the work of people like Dionne Brand, like M. Norbesi Phillip, right, who gives us this model of a different kind of logics when she takes that court case related to the Zong, those Africans had been thrown overboard so the traders could get insurance money, and that had gone to court. She takes that court case and rips it into shreds, and then reassembles in arbitrary fashion those pieces to come up with something that somehow brilliantly exceeds that logic. I mean, that kind of boldness that I see in Black women writers and thinkers is what I hold on to. I think of the work of Mariam Kaba, who is an activist in the United States, or Christina Sharp, who is my colleague and one of the most brilliant thinkers that I know. And of course, I'm naming primarily Black women. They're Indigenous women like Joyce Green, Gina Starblanket, who have been doing similar work in Indigenous studies. But for me, Black studies has offered me a footprint for walking through the world, and the steps that I walk in primarily are steps that have been tracked by women, both who have gone before me and who are walking with me now.
Do we think we have time for one last question in case there's one?
We do have time for one last question.
Excellent.
Maybe it's for you, Alejandro.
Well, Professor Davis was, Timothy Ituri. I prefer to hear Tim. Tim, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis.
Hi, Timothy.
I came in a little late, so I will have to watch a little bit more and listen to the presentation again. But I cannot help but notice that wonderful poster of Bob Marley behind you. And I'm wondering how his work and the work of other reggae musicians has shaped your thinking and work as a whole.
That is funny. That is very perceptive, but also funny. So somehow I have a poster of Bob Marley in all of my working spaces. So I have a poster of Bob Marley in my office at York, which I had from I was a graduate student, and it started to fade and rip, and I had to take it somewhere and had it preserved, and it goes with me everywhere. It's always in my office, and I have one here. I think it's part of it's a kind of grounding for me, a reminder of all of the journeys that I have taken, and the ways in which those have shaped me and continue to shape me. So I don't see Bob Marley as a kind of flawless human being or anything like that, but certainly growing up in Jamaica, he was part of an important animation of, Black justice and livingness and beauty and so on, but also a very specific kind of Jamaican culture. So I guess it's a reminder to me and everyone else that Jamaica is part of that narrative that has framed me, and I come out of that kind of, early school of liberation justice that I think he was a part of in his travels to Africa, his travels to South Africa, and Mozambique, and the ways in which that carried. When I went to Ghana, and I would say to people, I'm Canadian, because they would all think I'm American, and then I'd say I'm Canadian, and they'd be a little more receptive. And then I would say I'm Jamaican, and they would be like, oh my gosh, we love you, right? And they all had on Bob Marley t-shirts. So yeah, so that's just a part of my kind of, my Jamaican identity. I just want to give a shout out to one of my former students, Donna Marie Hamilton, who is here. I think, Donna, when I taught you, I was a child. We were both children. I don't know if I had finished my degree or if I was still doing my PhD, but it's so lovely to see you. and to know that you are, I think, teaching at Royal Roads and doing wonderful things. So I wanted to make that shout out.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing discussion, Dr. Davis. I was reading just in the last few days, I was reading Tanya Shirley's book, The Merchant of Feathers, her poems, which is an extraordinary book about girlhood in Jamaica. And it was so lovely to hear you talk today, and to talk about Bob Marley too, who's one of my heroes. So thank you so much for being with us today. What a wonderful way for us to conclude Black History Month at Royal Roads University. And I want to thank in particular Alejandro for organizing this event, and thank you all who joined us today, and thank Media Services and people who made this technically possible. And this has been one of our great learnings through the pandemic, that we can convene in these forums and we can get speakers in who don't necessarily have to travel to us. They can travel to us virtually. And it's been such a wonderful opportunity for us to gather together to be part of this important conversation. And I know that many of us will be leaving here having had our thought patterns constructively interrupted. So thank you so much for that. So thank you, everybody. And I know it's Monday, just the beginning of the week, but I do hope you have a productive week and enjoy your week here. I'd point out to Dr. Davis too, that it's snowing in Victoria today, which is extremely unusual, because normally we boasting at this time of year about our spring, but I think we are joining you in spirit in just enjoying a little more of this Canadian winter. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And again, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you. Goodbye.